The dust of the saloon floor tasted of stale beer and regret, a fine grit that coated the tongues of the silent men who watched. It was the silence that was the loudest thing in the room, a screaming void where noise and courage ought to have been. The girl, Ilara, lay not 2 feet from the bat-wing doors she'd burst through moments before, a fallen sparrow with a broken wing. Her breath came in ragged, shallow little gasps, a counterpoint to the heavy, confident footsteps of the man who now stood over her. Marcus Thorne was a man carved from greed and arrogance, his tailored coat a stark offense against the dusty, work-worn denims of the other patrons. His face, usually a mask of smug satisfaction, was tight with fury. He owned the bank, he owned the land, he owned the debt, and in a town like Redemption Creek, that meant he owned the people. He gestured to the crumpled form on the floor with a flick of his wrist, as if shooing away a stray dog. "This," he announced, his voice slicing through the thick air, "is what happens when property forgets its place. It gets corrected." He looked around the room, his eyes lingering on each man, a silent threat that needed no words. He was daring them. Daring them to feel a flicker of pity, a spark of defiance, so he could extinguish it with the heel of his polished boot. Men who had wrestled steers to the ground and faced down winter blizzards suddenly found the grain of their wooden tables intensely fascinating. Sheriff Brody, a man whose tin star felt heavier than an anvil, stood near the bar, his hand hovering near his pistol, but his gaze was fixed on the far wall, a study in practiced neutrality. He was a good man trapped in a coward's job, a reality Thorne exploited every single day. Ilara stirred, a soft moan escaping her bruised lips. Her eyes fluttered open, wide with a terror that was ancient and profound. She tried to push herself up, to crawl away, but her limbs would not obey. Thorne chuckled, a low, guttural sound of ownership. He bent down, his hand reaching not to help her, but to grab a fistful of her tangled hair. "Time to go home, little trinket," he sneered. But before his fingers could close around their prize, the world seemed to tilt on its axis. The girl's body, which had been sagging toward the floor in a final, exhausted faint, was suddenly lifted. A shadow had detached itself from the darkest corner of the saloon, a corner most men avoided. Jedodiah Stone had been sitting there for an hour, a single glass of whiskey untouched before him, his presence as unassuming as a fieldstone and just as immovable. No one ever spoke to Jedodiah. He was a ghost in broad daylight, a man who worked his small, hard-scrabble ranch on the edge of Thorne's vast holdings, his face a roadmap of some private sorrow. Now, that ghost was holding the fainting girl in his arms, her head resting against the worn fabric of his shirt. He hadn't made a sound. He had moved with a speed that was unnatural, a panther uncoiling from the shadows. Thorne straightened up, his face a blotchy canvas of crimson and white. He was so stunned, so utterly flabbergasted that anyone, least of all this silent spectre, would dare interfere, that for a moment he was speechless. "Put it down, Stone," he finally managed to hiss, his voice dripping with venom. "That is my property you're holding." Jedodiah's eyes, the color of a winter sky over a frozen lake, lifted from the girl's pale face and settled on Thorne. They were devoid of fear, devoid of anger, devoid of anything but a profound and chilling emptiness. He looked through Thorne, as if the man were nothing more than a pane of dirty glass. The entire saloon held its breath, the tension a physical thing, a pressure building against their eardrums. Every man in that room knew the violence Thorne was capable of. They had seen his hired muscle-beater farmer for being late on a loan. They had seen him foreclose on families in the dead of winter. And now, this quiet rancher was holding the object of the tyrant's wrath. Jedodiah adjusted his hold on the girl, pulling her closer to his chest as if to shield her from the world. He looked down at her bruised face, at the tear track that cut a clean path through the grime on her cheek. A flicker of something ancient and painful moved behind his eyes, a ghost of a memory. He leaned his head down, his lips close to her ear, and in a voice so low it was barely a whisper, yet a whisper that seemed to fill the entire, silent room, he said the words that would change everything. "I got you now. What is it that makes a man stand when all others sit? When fear is a poison in the air, what is the antidote that allows one soul to breathe free and act? Is it courage, or is it something deeper? A pain so great that all other fears become meaningless?" Jedodiah Stone turned and walked toward the saloon doors, carrying the girl as if she weighed nothing at all. The crowd, a sea of frozen statues, parted for him without conscious thought. Thorne's two thugs, brutish men paid to inflict pain, took a half-step forward but stopped dead when Jedodiah's gaze swept over them. It was not a threat. It was a promise. A promise of a desolation they could not possibly comprehend. "Stone!" Thorne roared, his composure finally shattering. "You'll hang for this. That's theft. Brody, arrest him!" Sheriff Brody's hand finally fell away from his gun. He looked at Thorne, then at the receding back of the rancher, a man walking into a storm of his own making. "On what charge, Marcus?" Brody asked, his voice weary. "Stealing what?" "A person ain't a still bag. There's no bill of sale for a soul." For the first time in years, the sheriff's voice held a spine. It was a small thing, a fragile thing, but it was there. Thorne, sputtering with rage, watched Jedodiah disappear into the unforgiving glare of the afternoon sun, a silent man carrying a broken girl, and with them, the last shred of Thorne's undisputed authority. The door of the boarding house was a welcoming blue, a stark contrast to the mud and misery of the main street. Sarah, the proprietor, a widow with kind eyes and a spine forged in prairie hardship, took one look at the girl in Jedodiah's arms and ushered them in without a word. She was one of the few people in town not indebted to Marcus Thorne, and it gave her a freedom the others had long forgotten. In a quiet back room, as Sarah gently bathed Ilara's face with a warm cloth, Jedodiah stood sentinel by the window, his gaze fixed on the street. He was watching, waiting. The sun bled across the horizon, painting the clouds in hues of orange and violet, a beautiful death to a brutal day. Ilara woke to the scent of lavender soap and the soft scratch of clean sheets. For a moment, she was suspended in a peaceful limbo, a place without fear. Then memory came rushing back like a flash flood, the chase, the saloon, the leering face of Thorne, the fall into darkness. A gasp escaped her lips and she shot upright, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Easy now, child," Sarah's calm voice soothed. "You're safe here." Ilara's wild eyes darted around the room, landing on the tall, silent figure by the window. "Jedodiah." She remembered the feeling of being lifted, the solid strength of his arms, the impossible whisper. He turned from the window, his face unreadable in the dimming light. He didn't approach, didn't speak, simply acknowledged her with a slow nod. His stillness was unnerving, yet strangely calming. He was a wall, a mountain, something that did not bend. Down the street, in the opulent office above the bank, Marcus Thorne paced like a caged animal. Humiliation was a foreign and bitter taste in his mouth. He had been defied. Publicly. By a nobody, a dirt scratcher. It was an insult that could not stand. His thugs, Cole and Roscoe, stood uneasily by the door. He just walked out, Cole mumbled, still unable to process it. Didn't even look scared. Thorne slammed his fist on his mahogany desk. "Fear is a tool, you idiot. If he doesn't have it, we give it to him. We remind him what this town is. It's mine." He went to the sheriff's office first, full of bluster and legal threats. "I have an indenture contract, Brody. Signed by her father. She belongs to me until the debt is paid. What Stone has done is theft, and you are legally obligated to retrieve my property." Sheriff Brody polished a pair of spectacles, taking his time. The small act of defiance in the saloon had kindled a tiny ember in his chest. "A piece of paper is one thing, Marcus. But the girl is covered in bruises. Bruises you put there. There are laws about cruelty, 2 laws." Thorne laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "I am the law in this town. My money is the law." Brody sighed, the ember dimming slightly. "I'll talk to him, Marcus. I'll tell him to see sense." But as Brody walked toward the boarding house, he knew this was different. He had seen Jedodiah Stone's eyes. You don't tell a man like that to see sense. A man like that operates on a different kind of logic, a code written in scars and silence. He found Jedodiah on the porch, oiling the action of a Winchester rifle. The setting sun glinted off the steel. "Jed," Brody began, keeping his voice even. "You can't win this. Thorn has the contract. He has the money, the men. All you have is. That girl. Jedodiah slid the bolt home with a soft, metallic click. He looked up at the sheriff. Is that all it takes, then? A piece of paper and a few hired guns to make a man turn his back. Brody shifted his weight. It's not about turning your back. It's about being smart. Surviving. Give him the girl, and this all goes away. You can go back to your ranch. Jedodiah stood up, his height seeming to swallow the last of the evening light. Some of us have nothing left to go back to, Sheriff. Some of us are already living in the after. This isn't about my ranch. It's about that girl sleeping in there, believing for the first time in a long time that the monsters might not win. He turned and went back inside, leaving Sheriff Brody alone on the porch with the encroaching darkness and the heavier weight of his own conscience. The silence of the boarding house was a fragile sanctuary. For 2 days, an unspoken truce held over Redemption Creek. Thorn gathered his forces, bringing in hard men from out of the territory, letting the town see them, letting the fear ferment. Jedodiah used the time to prepare. He boarded up the lower windows of Sarah's house, not with clumsy planks, but with carefully measured and reinforced beams. He checked sightlines from the upper floors. He moved with an economy of motion that spoke of long and terrible practice. Sarah watched him, her heart aching. She saw not just a protector, but a man haunted by a legion of ghosts. You don't have to do this, Jedodiah, she said softly one evening, placing a plate of stew on the table where he sat cleaning his revolver. You can take the girl and ride out. No one would blame you. He paused, the cylinder of the pistol in his palm. They would, he said, his voice a low rumble. And they'd be right. But it ain't them I'm worried about. In the quiet moments, Elara began to talk. Her story came out in hesitant pieces, a mosaic of heartbreak and abuse. Her father, a good man broken by drought and drink, had signed the indenture note to Thorn in a desperate gamble. After he passed, Thorn had come to collect. The work was endless, the food scarce, the punishment swift and brutal. She wasn't a person to him, she was an asset, a thing to be used and discarded. She showed Jedodiah the one treasure she had managed to keep hidden, a small wooden bird, worn smooth with years of anxious rubbing. My mother carved it for me, she whispered, her eyes shining with unshed tears. She said it was a sparrow. That even the smallest bird can find its way home. Jedodiah looked at the little carving, and his hand, a hand steady enough to sight a rifle at 200 yards, trembled. He instinctively reached for his own neck, his fingers brushing against a worn leather cord tucked beneath his collar. A muscle in his jaw jumped. He said nothing, but his silence was a confession of a deep and terrible wound. The sight of her simple, hopeful treasure had torn it wide open. He wasn't just seeing Elara anymore. He was seeing a small face, framed by blonde curls. He was smelling the smoke. He was hearing a cry that had been swallowed by the roar of flames. He pushed the memory down, locking it away in the iron vault of his heart, but the effort cost him. A thin sheen of sweat broke out on his brow. Elara, perceptive in the way of those who have had to read moods for survival, saw the shift. Does it remind you of something? She asked gently. Jedodiah stood abruptly and walked to the window, his back to her. Get some rest, he said, his voice rough. He'll be coming soon. He knew Thorn's kind. The public humiliation would fester, and the only balm for that kind of pride was public, overwhelming violence. He wouldn't just come for the girl. He would come to burn down the idea that anyone could stand against him. Later that night, as Elara slept a fitful, dream-haunted sleep, Sarah found Jedodiah on the porch again, staring out into the moon-drenched street. The Winchester lay across his lap. It was a girl, wasn't it? Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. Jedodiah didn't turn. He just nodded, a barely perceptible movement in the dark. My little Anna. And my wife, Mary. Sarah waited, knowing the silence needed to be given its space. There was a man like Thorn, Jedodiah finally said, his voice thick and rusted with disuse. Wanted my water rights. Tried to buy me out, then threatened me out. When I wouldn't break, he He decided to burn me out. His voice cracked on the last words. I was in town, getting supplies. By the time I saw the smoke, it was too late. I lost everything. Not the land. Not the house. Everything. He looked at his hands, calloused and strong, the hands of a rancher. But in his mind, they were useless, helpless hands that had arrived too late to pull his family from a burning pyre. I ran, he confessed, the word tasting like ash. Left the land, the memories. Came here. Thought I could just disappear. But you can't run from a thing like that. It rides with you. Now Sarah understood. The stillness. The silence. The haunted eyes. It wasn't emptiness. It was a fullness of grief so profound it had left no room for anything else. He wasn't saving Elara from Thorn. He was standing in front of his own burning house, trying to pull his daughter from the flames, one last time. This isn't your fault, Jedodiah, Sarah said, her voice full of a compassion he hadn't known in years. He looked at her then, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of the man he must have been before the fire. It is now, he said. And in that, there was no more grief. Only resolve. Dusk fell on the third day like a judgment. The air grew thick, heavy with unspoken dread. The usual evening sounds of Redemption Creek, a distant piano, laughter from the saloon, the nicker of horses, were gone, replaced by an expectant hush. Windows were shuttered, doors bolted. The town was holding its breath. Then came the sound. The rhythmic beat of a dozen horses walking in unison, a sound like a war drum. Marcus Thorn and his army of hired guns rode down the center of the street, their faces grim or grinning with malice. They were a plague on horseback. They reined in before the blue door of the boarding house, a dark tide lapping at a tiny island of defiance. Stone! Thorn's voice boomed, magnified by the silence. I gave you your chance to be sensible. Now you'll learn the price of sentiment. Send out my property, or I'll burn this house to the ground with all of you in it. Inside, Jedodiah looked at Sarah and Elara. His face was calm, the face of a man who had made his peace with whatever came next. The cellar, he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. The floor is thick. Stay in the back corner, away from the street. Sarah nodded, her face pale but determined. She took a trembling Elara by the hand. Be careful, Jedodiah, she whispered. He gave a slight nod. As they descended into the dusty dark, the first shot rang out, shattering an upstairs window. The siege had begun. Jedodiah was not a rancher playing soldier. He was a force of nature. He moved through the dark house like a wraith, using the angles and shadows he had memorized. A muzzle flash from the livery stable across the street was answered by a single, booming report from his Winchester. A man cried out and fell. Another tried to rush the front porch and was met with a blast from a shotgun Jedodiah had propped by the door. The night erupted into a cacophony of gunfire, splintering wood, and shouted curses. Thorn's men, mostly drunken bullies, were used to terrifying unarmed farmers, not fighting a ghost who was everywhere at once. From the sheriff's office, Brody heard the battle. He sat at his desk, the sound of each gunshot a hammer blow against his conscience. He saw Jedodiah's face, heard his words, "Is that all it takes?" Then he saw Elara's bruised cheek. He saw the smug, cruel face of Marcus Thorn, a man who had been strangling the life out of this town for years. With a deep, shuddering breath, Sheriff Brody stood up. He strapped on his gun belt, the leather creaking in the silent office. The weight of the pistol on his hip felt different tonight. Not a burden, but a tool. A responsibility. He walked out into the street, a lone figure walking toward the fire. Thorn, he yelled, his voice clear and steady. This is official business. Lay down your arms. Thorn, crouched behind a water trough, laughed. You finally lost your mind, Brody. Kill him. But as two of Thorn's men turned their guns on the sheriff, a window on the general store opened. Old Man Hemlock, the store owner Thorn was threatening to foreclose on, rested a hunting rifle on the sill. A rifle barked from the blacksmith's shop. Another from the saloon roof. The cowardly crowd, seeing their lawman finally choose a side, had been inspired. The embers of their own courage, long dormant, had been fanned into a flame. The fight turned. Thorne's hired army, caught between Jedodiah's deadly precision and the newly armed townspeople, began to break and run. It was no longer a siege, it was a rout. In the chaos, Thorne saw his power evaporating. Desperate, he did what all cowards do, he sought a shield. He ran for the boarding house, kicking in the weakened front door. He found the cellar entrance and stormed down into the darkness, dragging a screaming Elara up into the embattled street. "Stop!" Thorne bellowed, holding the terrified girl in front of him, a pistol pressed to her temple. "Everybody stop, or she dies!" The shooting sputtered to a halt. The street fell silent once more, littered with the wounded and the fleeing. Jedodiah emerged from the shadows of the porch, his rifle held loosely at his side. He saw Elara, her eyes wide with terror. He saw Thorne's desperate, triumphant sneer. And he saw the small, wooden bird, which had fallen from Elara's pocket, lying in the dust at Thorne's feet. With a grunt of rage and contempt, Thorne stomped on it, grinding the small carving into splintered pieces under his heel. "No more silly little hopes," he spat. And that was the moment the world broke for Jedodiah Stone. The battle, the guns, the town, it all faded away. He slowly, deliberately, reached up and pulled the leather cord from around his neck. Dangling from it was another wooden bird, or rather, half of one. It was charred and broken, but the shape was unmistakable. It would have fit perfectly with the pieces now crushed in the dust. "That," Jedodiah said, his voice no longer a whisper, but a raw, broken thing full of shattered memories and endless night. "That was my daughter's. Anna. She was holding it when the fire took our home." He looked directly at Thorne, but he was seeing another man, another greedy tyrant from another lifetime. A fire set by a man who wanted what wasn't his. "A man just like you." Thorne stared, his mind struggling to grasp the meaning. In that split second of confusion, Jedodiah moved. He was not a blur of speed now. He was something more terrifying. He was inevitable. He lunged forward, not for the gun, but for Thorne's wrist. There was a crack of bone, a scream of agony from Thorne as the pistol clattered to the ground. Jedodiah spun him around, slamming him face down into the dirt, his knee pressed into Thorne's back. He could have ended it. Every soul in that street expected it. But he didn't. He looked down at the pathetic, whimpering man, and then he looked at Elara, who was staring at him, her chest heaving with sobs. He saw the terror in her eyes, and he knew that one more act of violence, even a justified one, would only scar her deeper. He had fought the monster outside. Now he had to kill the one within. With a shuddering breath, he pulled back. He had faced the fire again, and this time, he had not run. He had saved the girl. Mercy, not vengeance, was the final victory. The dawn that broke over Redemption Creek was the first clean dawn the town had seen in years. The light felt different, warmer, as if it had to burn through less shadow to reach the street. Marcus Thorne, his arm in a crude splint, was locked in the sheriff's own jail cell, his power broken, his authority shattered. The men who had fought alongside the sheriff stood a little taller, their eyes meeting each other with a newfound respect. They had taken their town back. Jedodiah sat on the steps of the boarding house porch, the morning sun on his face. In his palm, he held the splintered pieces of two wooden birds, Elara's and his own. He tried to fit them together, a puzzle of grief and hope. Elara came and sat beside him. She didn't speak, just watched his calloused fingers working with the delicate fragments. "He broke it," she said softly, her voice thick with sorrow for the last piece of her mother. "Yes," Jedodiah said. "But wood can be mended. And some things aren't meant to be replaced. They're meant to be honored." He looked at her, and for the first time, the frozen lake in his eyes began to thaw. He saw not the ghost of his lost daughter, but the fierce, resilient spirit of the young woman beside him. He had not erased his past, but he had finally stopped being its prisoner. He had paid his debt, not to the world, but to himself, to the man he was supposed to be. In saving her, he had found the path back. He offered her the broken pieces. "We can fix them," he said. Together Thilara looked from the shattered wood to his steady gaze, and a small, fragile smile touched her lips. It was the first real smile she had shown, and it was more beautiful than the sunrise. In a town named Redemption, a silent rancher had found his, not in violence or vengeance, but in a quiet promise whispered to a fallen girl, "I got you now." He had kept that promise. And in doing so, he had saved them both. We all face moments when it's easier to look away, to let injustice stand because the cost of fighting seems too high. But what is the true cost of silence? Think about the Jedodiah stones in your own world, the quiet heroes waiting for a reason to stand. What will it take for you to be one of them? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that remind us of the strength within.